Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us here on the program, where we cover the most interesting live trials and legal stories in the news today. We have a big trial that we're going to be live in. We have a lot to recap, and we're also carefully monitoring a verdict in another trial. A lot to talk about. Let's get started right now. Okay, so let's break it down right now. Joining me is forensic death investigator Joseph Scott Morgan. He's talking to us from Jacksonville State University. Joseph, are you surprised by this verdict?
Yeah, actually, I was. Remember, we were chatting about this yesterday, Jesse. My thought as I was sitting here watching this, I think that the jury was compelled, I believe at least, not by the scientific evidence, but by the totality of the circumstances that he was there. And they were able, at least in their own reasoning, to put the weapon in his hand because, as we heard, from the defense, there was no linkage scientifically, and so that leads me to the conclusion that they were compelled merely by his presence being there and all of the peripheral evidence that surrounded this thing.
Yeah, and it was interesting because it basically seemed to suggest if he was there, and it was certain clear he was there, what was he doing other than engaging in this ambush? And they were able to get him under two different theories, whether he was actually a shooter or just part of a principle of this ambush attack, and clearly they thought it was enough. I mean, what really signaled out to you from what the prosecution argued?
From the prosecution's perspective, it was a matter of putting this group of people together, and of course the target, who this gentleman was just strafed, is the only way I can really address this thing. He was just absolutely brutalized, and he was targeted. Unfortunately, these other two victims, these young ladies, happened to be collateral at that point in time. And I got to tell you, something that really stood out to me yesterday was the fact that I think that this guy, they fired a kill shot into his head at almost point blank range. It gave me a sense as a forensic scientist that they were within probably about 12 inches when they discharged that weapon into his head.
Yeah, that's something that couldn't be ignored. I remember we talked about that yesterday. I want to go back to the prosecution's closing argument, where they really laid out quite the case against the defendant. Let's show it to you. Okay, so Joseph, you heard the prosecutor. Really, the physical evidence in this case probably sealed the deal. I'm curious your thoughts. I mean, the idea, what was in Vasata's pockets, what was in the car that he was next to when he was found, how his DNA matches up to key pieces of evidence, including the fact that the murder weapons were found by the getaway car. How do you think DNA and his DNA, and specifically, as well as his location and what was found on his person, how it all tied together? What do you think?
Well, it leaves a specific signature, and this goes to the overarching narrative here, Jesse, that this thread that runs through all of the stuff that connects it together. Yeah, we don't, they talked about the extended mag on the 40 Glock, the rounds that were in the chamber, how they didn't find any trace elements there relative to DNA or fingerprints and that sort of thing. And again, every time you touch something does not necessarily mean that you're going to leave a trace behind, but it is the sum total of all of these parts that bring this thing together and interweave it. And that's what the prosecution has done effectively. You cannot just simply walk past all of this physical evidence and the totality of the circumstances and completely dismiss it. And I don't think any reasonable person on that jury could do that. That's why they came back with murder one, which again is kind of interesting to me, because I really felt like they were going for a murder one with hopes that they were going to hit two, but they really hit the jackpot.
Yeah, they put a kind of a wide net. They said, okay, listen, jury, even if you don't believe that he had an intention, a premeditated design to go there and kill kill individuals that night, then at least the fact he knew he was engaging in a very dangerous activity, opening fire into that courtroom, that would be into that backyard, that would of course be second degree, or in the very least it's manslaughter, a reckless action. Of course, they found him guilty on the top charge, and it seemed to be a situation, if they were going to find him guilty of murder one for one of the victims, they were going to find him guilty of murder one on all of them.
Yeah, I'd have to concur, Jesse. Keep in mind, he showed up, they showed up with all of these means at their disposal to do great harm. How do you explain the fact that you've got this AK-47 platform, you've got the Taurus revolver, you've got the Glock 40, all of these things that are present there that, wind up being, that wind up brutalizing these three people. And of course, the defendant was shot himself. And you just have to look at this. I think another compelling part here is she's talking about, you can't walk down I-95 carrying this rifle. She's right. Well, how does all that stuff wind up in the culvert? And they're talking about the dark clothing that he had, and she's painting a very ominous picture for the court.
Yeah, why would he have bullets on his person? Why would his license be in the BMW where there's an empty rifle bag and bullets? I mean, again, what the defense tried to say was he may have been there, there might have been weapons, but you can't prove he had the intention other than just to negotiate in good faith with Charles Vorpagel because there was some sort of conflict going on. Things took a sour turn. He ends up getting shot. I saw what the defense was doing. I thought it seemed pretty compelling. They gave a great closing argument. I mean, we were looking at it.
Yeah, they did. And I have to say, given what the defense had, they did a jam-up job lawyering yesterday in that closing argument. I thought it was very well done. If you're looking at this just from a nuts and bolts standpoint, I thought they did a fantastic job with what they were given. But sometimes that's all defense has to work with. So, they get high marks to them for their closing statement.
Yeah, maybe we'll have an opportunity to talk about their closing a little bit later on. Okay, so Joseph, he was a really important witness, but I always wondered how effective his testimony was, considering he couldn't possibly identify the shooters. And let's not forget, it was very dark that night. It's a chaotic shooting. I imagine identification becomes a big issue in these kinds of cases, let alone this one.
Yeah, it's very chaotic when you begin to see the total, kind of frenetic environment in which this is taking place. Remember, this is in the dark. They're wearing dark clothing. So making an identification per these individuals, plus it's not just making an identification in the dark, Jesse. It's the fact that you've got these tiny explosions going off, which is something that most people are not used to experiencing. So it affects the brain. It affects the ability to recognize anybody, even if their faces weren't covered.
One of the things that he said that was still not entirely accurate, he originally said there were 3 people. It's been debated if there were 3 people or not. The prosecution, I think you could argue, conceded there were 3 people, but they couldn't identify who the third person was. Is it possible that somebody who's a witness to a shooting might have seen an extra person when really there wasn't an extra person there?
Yeah, absolutely. There were studies that were done about eyewitness interviews following traumatic events. There's all kinds of things many times that eyewitnesses see. And after a period of time, your brain begins to kind of layer these things out. A guy named Dr. Stein did these studies way back over 100 years ago relative to this. And you see that the brain becomes kind of disoriented and it's highly traumatic. So yeah, it's possible. Yeah. That's within the realm of possibility.
Well, we know Marcus Stewart is Vasata's co-defendant. He's going to face trial. And then there's this other guy, Lou Kasukis, who the defense has said is the real shooter here. And even the prosecution said, well, we can't really say anything about this man yet. He may eventually be charged. He hasn't been. And we're going to have to see what happens with him. I do want to go back to Charles Vorpagel when he was cross-examined by the defense. Let's see what they had to say. Now, Joseph, one of the things that I know it confused me, and I don't know how the jury wrestled with it. When you deal with these kinds of cases, you're dealing with people that were engaged in illegal activity. So the backdrop of feuds, drug deals, drug sales, this guy had a house filled with weapons and drugs. There was a part where I thought the defense was going to be saying, and they were trying to conflate, look, who knows what he was up to? Who knows who was in his life? And I was curious what you thought about that in these kinds of shootings and how it played into it.
It's, it's difficult lots of times to understand the players involved in these cases because it is multi-layered. This even goes to the investigation, not just to the courtroom. And you're trying to kind of beat your way through this underbrush, if you will, trying to understand who these people are. Lots of times they'll use their given name, but they'll also have street names and they'll be referred to. And many times this is a tactic to put people back on their heels that are looking into their lives. So yeah, it does get quite convoluted. You're dealing with people who essentially make their living by deceiving others. So that concurrently, it makes it difficult. But this guy is not. He doesn't give off the appearance on stand to be some kind of raving lunatic. As a matter of fact, he's cold and he seems very calculated about what he does. And this group of guys that shows up at this house party that he was having, it was, you're throwing this frenetic incident into this otherwise probably controlled environment in which he lives in. He controls everything that goes on there. Especially
claiming the lives of two women who were just unrelated to any of this. There was talks about Sean Henry, one of the victims, that he might have been involved in this feud. And again, it's just tragic to think about any of the victims. But you have these two young women who were just there having a good time, and they were caught up in the crossfire. They were never the intended targets as well. That's the question that I have for you. Based upon what you've seen, does this appear to be an execution-style shooting?
Well, I think that the physical evidence on the male victim kind of bears, at least in my mind, bears this out. And I'll go back again to this gunshot wound that he has to his head. For the young ladies, no, I think that they again happen to be peripheral players in this, and I don't think the intent was, as best I can make it out at least, the intent was to do harm to these ladies. They were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. However, the male victim, given the overkill that is involved in this case, he was riddled, and also this location to his head where he was shot, that paints a different picture.
Oh, absolutely, and it really does tell a lot of the story. Unfortunately, these victims are not here to tell their story, but we did hear from Charles Vorpagel. We're going to maybe focus on this trial a little bit later on. Our focus when we come back, though, is James Scandarito Jr. because his sentencing is today. We'll be back.